welcome everyone to TRT World's next forum. My name is Jaffar Hasnain. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my greetings to TRT's Deputy Director General, Mr. Omar Farooq Thandaverdi, our esteemed panelists, and of course, the audience, the youth. Thank you very much for being with us here today. Throughout the day, we will be hosting different panels and workshops, so we are really looking forward to an exciting day. Let's jump right into our first panel of the day. About 3 years ago, the world we live in today used to be much different from what it has become right now. You must be wondering why. Well, I think the answer is pretty evident: the coronavirus pandemic. It has devastated the lives of millions of people, in fact, billions of people across the world. Just before coming here, I was checking the latest numbers, and as of today, more than 600 confirmed cases of COVID-19 have been reported across the world. Unfortunately, more than 6 million people have been killed by the virus. And apart from that, this pandemic has taken a huge economic toll on economies across the world. But most importantly, it has had a huge impact on the mental health of people, especially youngsters. On the other hand, it has also negatively impacted the way of life, our social life. So our next panel is called Building Back Together, Social Recovery Post-Pandemic. Before I introduce my panelist, let's take a quick look at this video, which is about this session prepared by TRT World's Next Forum team. Great. Now, let me call my panelists. The first one is Tanzila Khan. She is the founder of girlythings.pk. Tanzila.
Like me to be? Maybe here, somewhere? Yeah?
Sure.
I can park anywhere.
It's fine. I think it's better here, yeah. Thank you so much. The next one is Kenidra Carey. She's a mental health advocate and social justice activist. Please. Joshua Coombes. He's a British hairstylist and founder of #DoSomethingForNothing. And finishing our panel is Job Amupanda. He's a social justice activist. All right, once again, thank you very much for being with us today here in this important forum. Now, like I said in the introduction, this pandemic has devastated the lives of billions of people across the world. Now, of course, when the pandemic began, the primary idea was to find a vaccine. So most of the focus in the beginning of the pandemic was towards finding a solution to the disease itself. But now I think the focus has shifted towards recovering humanity from this pandemic. And I think the first thing that needs to be done is to set the expectations right. Let me begin with you, Kenidra. Is a complete recovery from this pandemic even possible?
I do believe so. I believe it starts with every individual, because I feel like we've been conditioned to see humans as harmful, like carriers of the disease, and to stay away from them, when we have the social distance. We've been conditioned to see each other as that way. And, I know that social distance, it didn't just start, it's like a common measure for a lot of these past like pandemics or diseases, whatever you want to call it. Like, but I do believe it's possible. But I feel like the conversation needs to start. Somebody needs to take the initiative. You know, like when we start seeing each other as equals and that we're all human and we're all trying to adjust and navigate this thing called life, and especially post-pandemic, I believe that's where it starts, honestly.
Okay, so somebody needs to take an initiative. Tanzila, now you are
Yeah.
someone who has taken many initiatives in your own country,
Yes.
Pakistan, and most of them are focused towards empowering the underprivileged people. How important is it to empower the underprivileged people in order to build back together?
I think a very false narrative that often we get entangled with is when we want to empower a certain community. I think that's where we get it wrong, especially for people with disabilities and young people like us. Nobody needs empowerment. What we need is a space to be ourselves because we all hold certain powers, skills that the world needs. And I'm working on a board game now to prove this point, that when you invest in accessibility, whether it's for the minds or for the infrastructure, everyone wins. Whether you want to make money, whether you want to reach out to more people, you're giving access to the world. So during pandemic, I think we learned some important lessons about our priorities. And the top one being, that should have been hygiene, but we kind of skipped it and we moved forward with our own material gains. But I think now it's time, to your first question as well, that yes, a post-recovery is possible if we get our priorities right this time.
Okay, a post-recovery is possible. I'm going to add one more question here. And sorry, apologies in advance. We are tight on time, so apologies if I have to interject. Tanzila, but is the world ever going to become like it used to be before this pandemic began?
I think the world has a chance to become better. Because during the pandemic, we saw something remarkable. We saw that when we all were confined to our rooms, there were ideas popping out. There were young people starting their own businesses. There were people coming out who were in abusive relationships, and they didn't want to be there anymore. So I think the pandemic has reset, and we have lost so many people because of ignorance, because of our lack of priorities in order. We've lost our friends and family. We owe it to them. There is no other option. We have to make the world a better place so that we never lose anyone like that ever again.
Very good.
Absolutely agree.
Joshua, let me come to you now. Again, like
All right.
Tanzila in your own country,
Yeah.
England, you also came up with initiatives to help underprivileged communities. You offered free haircuts to people on the street. So I would like to put them as acts of kindness. Now, how important is it for us to become kind towards one another if we want to build back together?
Yeah, it's really important. Hello, everyone, by the way. I thought it's nice to at least greet and say hi. I feel that, you know, the work that I do briefly, you know, I work a lot with people who are quite vulnerable, living on the streets in different cities. A haircut's this really small thing, but it's a way to spend time with someone and connect with someone. And a lot of the time, these are people who don't have a roof over their head. The biggest part of the thing that I do, I feel, is actually try and bridge a gap through isolation. And the reason why I was so interested in this panel, and I think it's something we've all felt collectively, globally now, is to feel what that's like in some way, to feel that isolation, and how fundamental and how integral that is to be human, to need connection with people around you. So to the question, just to answer the first one slightly too as well, I mean, do we want things to be the same as they were? I think, you know, we can use this as a springboard to a better place if we try. And I think that focusing on that isolation and remembering the things that are really important to us, those things that a lot of people were starved of for a long time, those really day-to-day things that some of us probably took for granted, being able to put your arm around somebody, being able to like have that touch, being able to spend time with your loved ones. For me, the people that I see on a regular basis, it became even more difficult for them overnight. It became even more of a struggle for them overnight. And one thing I will say is, especially talking from the standpoint of the UK and, you know, where I'm from, the government pretty much in about 3 or 4 weeks put everybody inside. There was some people who fell beneath the cracks. You know, I'm talking about people experiencing homelessness, but you saw that when people were incubators for a virus, suddenly there was this will from society to be able to try and fix this in some way. And it shows that I think that where there is enough will, there is a way, certainly. And we're living in this time at the moment where these issues we're looking at have been normalized. Before the pandemic, something like homelessness, for me, a lot of the places I travel to, it's normalized. We think it's normal to live in societies that have so much, in cities that are so affluent, and so many people suffer. But this is not normal, and this should never be perceived as normal. But I think moving on from the pandemic, it's about trying to find what the new normal looks like. And for me, I think it's about providing a better level of care for the most vulnerable, and focusing on that thing that we can all relate to now, which is our shared well-being, our shared mental health, and trying to include and make that more inclusive for everybody.
Okay. Just want to pick up on one thing you mentioned about the pandemic, that we don't know how the new normal is going to look like. The idea is to embrace it. But, I was reading this book written by Richard Horton, if I'm not mistaken. I may be getting his name wrong. He's the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, which is one of the most renowned medical journals. In his book, he says that this pandemic is not something unprecedented. I know as a journalist, since day one, since the pandemic began, media across the world was saying, oh my God, this is something unprecedented. We have never seen something like this happen ever before, but that's inaccurate. It happened before. The Black Death, which plagued Europe. The flu pandemic in the early 19th century. So certainly there's a role that officials, authorities had to play based on past pandemics. And in many ways, in some countries, they failed in playing that role. So, Job, let me come to you. What kind of role do you think governments, officials, authorities need to play in order to come up with a robust post-pandemic policy?
Well, maybe let me perhaps start with where you just ended that conversation. We had the Spanish flu of 1918, I think. The number of people that died must be 80 million worldwide. I don't think the COVID death have even come closer to something like that. So
it's about 6 million right now.
Yeah, so it's not even closer to that specific number. I certainly don't agree with this, some sort of universality approach to the COVID experiences, because we're different people, different places. I come from a country that is one of the most unequal nations on the face of the earth. So when you had a lockdown, where you had a lot of poor people, it impacts people differently compared to what is happening in the UK, for instance. So we must, before we even say whether we can recover, we must be able to answer the question, what has been the experiences? What has been the experience when you say you are closing your borders? What has been experienced to say people must stay at home when they don't have homes, for instance, and things like that? I think there's a lot of lesson for us as Africans, for instance. There's been unemployment. People now realize that people can work from home. It's a problem. How do we recover from that? The machine has won. People know now that work can be done. So I actually don't need, some people will say, I actually don't need 20 employees. I can do with 5. What is the social consequences of a situation like that? So it is something that is a bit worrisome when you think about it. But also it gives us an opportunity to think in terms of what is it that can be done. For me, in answering your question directly, we need to redefine the state from this neoliberal role to say the state must somehow stay out. Now, imagine the COVID situation found us in capitalist or neoliberal states where the state is staying out. So you are saying, what can officials do? You are staying out, and then you realize that there are actual serious social consequences. For instance, we are actually talking about indigenous knowledge system. Funny enough, in Namibia, in rural areas, a lot of people who died because of COVID-19 are people who are well off, people with medical aid. But in rural areas where we thought, and in the slums, people, for some reason, people are not dying quantitatively. In fact, one journalist went to the villages and the answer said, no, what are you doing about COVID-19? And the response said, no, we hear that COVID-19 is a disease for the people in the cities. So what is actually happening is a disease for the rich. And it seems that there's some sort of indigenous practices in rural areas that they have employed to use. But the world of science, because these people are in remote areas, they are not regarded. Everybody must look at WHO guidelines. At one point when the pandemic started, they say gatherings are limited to 10 people. Government implemented this announcement, but in my grandmother's household, we are about 45. it basically meant that for breakfast in the morning, we're already in violation of government regulations. So this idea of universalism, as if we have one uniform experiences, we must say, in conclusion, the machine has won, actually. The machine has won, and you are going to have a serious social problem that is brought by unemployment. So we must actually push back and say, how do we recover in a sustainable way? How do we recover? Yes, I'm not saying we mustn't embrace technology, but to what cost? Must we embrace technology at the cost of the human being that is responsible for the creation of the machine?
Is a concern.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure you guys can hear me, right?
Not that well. No.
Can we fix this, please?
I'll have to take over then, I guess, as moderator.
In the meantime, before these guys come and fix my microphone, if you guys have any questions, please raise your hands. I'm going to take one or two questions from the audience. So, yeah. Anyone? I'm not sure if I were...
Oh, someone.
There's one?
Okay.
Hey,
There's one
yeah,
at
please come
your
down.
back too.
Sure. Thank you. Yes. What's your name?
My name is Kolaole Said.
What's up,
My question is to Mr. Joshua.
How are you, bro?
I want to ask that since what you're doing is to help poor people, do you think if there's balance between the rich and poor, the country that we live in, the world that we live in, will be a better place, or there will be a disbalance with that balance? Because if every one of us are equal and there is no difference between the rich and the poor, what do you think the world will be like?
Well, that's a very deep and very existential question that I suppose might take a while, and I appreciate it very much. The thing that I'd say, brothers, is I actually am not advocating for. I mean, what I do is I go out and I use my time. I should turn around to you because you asked the question. I go out and I use my time in a way that I feel like is positive for the people around me. So what I try and do is, in any scenario, wherever you live, wherever you're from, there's going to be disparity. There's going to be suffering. There's going to be people who are rich and people who are poor. And I think that is the way of the world, and that's certainly not going to change in my lifetime. And to be really honest, I don't think it's ever going to change. But what I think is important is for advocating for things you believe in, and my ethos really, because what I do is called Do Something for Nothing, and it's a broader movement of other people getting involved in different places in the world, and it's sort of just this recognition that you can feel really overwhelmed by all the things that are happening in the world. You can feel sometimes so fatigued by that in a way that sometimes you don't even want to get up off the sofa anymore, if you're just scrolling through social media and things are coming at you. But it's a shift and a personal transition to recognize, actually, I'm going to concentrate on the things I can do. And actually, I'm going to walk out into this world in a way that I want to see the world is, And that's sort of the way that I kind of go about my work. But your question is really interesting. I mean, obviously there's political answers for maybe what that could look like for a more decentralized system. Yes, I have opinions on that, and I have opinions on much more decentralized kind of systems of power so people can have more autonomy. I think, Job, what you're saying is unbelievably important, because this idea we have, especially in the West, and this arrogance sometimes that we have in the West, that we have this picture of what something is and we apply it to the rest of the world, it's no good. It's no good, and it doesn't mean that we can accept two things that exist at once, and we've got to get better at this. Someone might have a different opinion than you, even about COVID, and yes, I'm going to say even maybe about the vaccine. But we cannot create more division around this. We have to then first, as you said, speak to people, listen to them, learn, and move on forward. So I know I kind of answered your question, mate, but I hope that kind of works. And thank you. I appreciate it.
Thing you mentioned about inequalities and how the pandemic has exacerbated. And you also said that a lot of people, especially in poorer countries, in developing countries, used to think, in fact, some still think that this pandemic is a pandemic for the rich. And I think they have a reason to believe in that, because most of the policies regarding tackling this pandemic are directed towards the rich countries. I remember when the vaccines were being produced, there were some countries, rich countries in the world, which ordered enough vaccines to vaccinate their whole population over 5 times. Apologies to Canadians here, the country was Canada. So, Kenidra, let me come to you. How do we address these inequalities?
I think it first starts with acknowledging privilege. I think people have this thing where they feel guilty, and they feel like, oh, if I say I have privilege, then I'm a bad person. But I don't think that's necessarily it. I think when it first starts with acknowledging the situation, and then, you ask yourself, what can I do? How can I play a part with my privilege? Like, how can I use my privilege for good? And I think, people have every reason to think that this is for the rich, like this is for people that's wealthy, like this pandemic. Obviously, like, I don't want to discount the mental, like, aspect of it, because, like, I feel like everybody has suffered mentally from it, whether you have money or not. Like, this is a thing I also wanted to address. Like, I think this pandemic has also shown, hopefully I'm not getting away from the question, but I think this pandemic has also shown that, like, no matter what you have, no matter what you do, how you contribute to the world, like, people have struggled. People have been through mental health crises, and it shows you that, like, materialistic things don't matter in the end. Like, what matters is, who you are inside, and if you're taking care of yourself, if you're being a good person, like, how you contribute to the world, like, and then also it shows, like, it has also, like, been a thing of, are you being, like, kind to people, because it's like you never know, like, it's like we're all in a hard time, but yeah, so.
Indeed. We are going to discuss the mental health issue as part of this pandemic in a moment, but I want to focus on inequalities here for a second here. Tanzila, now, you mentioned in one of your earlier responses that this pandemic provides an opportunity for us to create a better world. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's not possible unless we address inequalities.
Absolutely.
Just picking up on what I said earlier about the vaccines, there were countries which ordered enough vaccines to vaccinate their whole population over 5 times, and there were continents, like Africa, which did not receive even a single dose of vaccine up until early last year. So how do we address this issue in particular?
Inequality is the product of, number one, ignorance, and number two, of power abuse. And now we live in a world that is more connected than ever before, and we need to have a trend of accountability, of calling out, and that's exactly where media comes in as well. That's where social media comes in, and that's where the voices of people come in, and their narration of their own stories of what they're going through. So why I'm a bit optimistic after this pandemic phase is because I want to highlight that we need to see we can use these as tools to drive ourselves in a better world. And inequality definitely affects people in different ways. For example, when I was going to get my vaccine, I did not have any high hopes at all. But when I went there, they had a special team for people with disabilities. And I was like, Pakistan, really? 2 points for Pakistan. I was so happy to see that my country is moving in that direction. And if they can think about people with disabilities when they had the vaccines and they were distributing, then they can think about other inequalities as well. I mean, they're thinking, processing is happening, right? So I think that it's very important to address these conversations and address communities not in a beneficiary way, because I don't think that's dignified. But we need to work with people, not for people.
Okay. And I think, please.
Let me add.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Joshua, that cannot be achieved until the world's most powerful countries are on board on this. For example, the US, your country, the UK. Because until and unless the West engages in policies that could possibly help in addressing this issue, it can never happen, right?
Well, yeah, and it's a hard thing to, because what we're talking about here with, like, the number of vaccines, as you said, and people who have so many, and then there's countries without. It's a reflection of what's happening in the West with individualism. I mean, or in the global perspective, I mean, it is hard to compute sometimes the idea that a billionaire can buy an island or a whole social media platform, and there's kids living on the street, you know, who can't even eat. I mean, those two things existing at once, it's a lot to take in as a person. But I think what has to happen in answer to your question is, you know, I can see in the US, I spent a lot of time in America and a lot of time in the UK, obviously. Until we create more, I think encourage, or at least show more examples of what community can look like in these countries, because it's so individualistic and the way things are going, people just looking after their own and the material things around them. I think it's hard for that to echo outwards. I think that the thing is, this is obviously a very difficult question, but I always bring it back to one person. I always bring it back to trying to, whether you're rich or poor, or whether you're, you know, you have or you have not, trying to recognize that there's a human being there, and we all feel pain, and we all do suffer in our own ways, and trying to have a human conversation is where I come at this from. I tell stories to be able to try and, of course I have a political conversation in my own way, but I try and keep it quite apolitical in the sense of like trying to talk about human beings and how we feel the same things and how we're a lot more similar than we're told to believe, you know? So yeah, so maybe it's a new, from my perspective, it's about trying to have that conversation in a different way. Like, I want to advocate for issues to be able to bring more equality, but how we get there for me might be slightly different.
All right, so it all starts It all starts at an individual level. Would you agree?
Well, I'm from a collectivist society, so obviously will not agree. Now, there is something very exciting, and I must say that we are, particularly for my country and my continent, Africa, that we are glad about. You see, in history, you must have seen a lot of African presidents and African ministers that are dying in London and in the US and everybody, in every places. Whenever they are sick, maybe they have a headache, they fly out. One of the things that we were very excited, because they know that they can always fly to London, they didn't take care of the health infrastructure in the country. Now, when the borders were closed, they couldn't fly in. It was wonderful also to see the African elite in those hospitals that are dilapidated, in those health facilities that are in need. So when they experience that, they will now learn to realize it's very important to take care of your own health infrastructures, because the Americans' borders were closed. Where could they go when they are sick? Of course, unfortunately, quite a number of them also died, but we are saying as activists and the generation of young people that are preparing to take over the governance of our countries, we are very excited about that experiences, that COVID. So it made it easier for us to advocate and say, hey, you must be very careful. Don't just think that since you have medical aid, you can always fly out of the country, take care of the infrastructure. That's one. Two, the other thing that is a positive aspect for us, it was always very difficult because if you look the top 5 unequal nations on the face of earth, our country, my country, must be number 3 or number 4, after South Africa, Brazil, and all those places. So what COVID actually gave us as an opportunity, which is also the model that was these relief measures that were taking place. For the municipality of Windhoek, and government, for instance, ended up giving free water to people. There was relief measures in terms of the income, and we're always advocating for basic wages and things like that. So the fight for social justice on the African continent, the fight for social justice in Namibia was also advanced by COVID-19. So of course, inequality is a problem, but those two specific aspects, it looks like it's funny. We're now glad that this political elite were forced to use the infrastructure, and hopefully because some of them had near-death experience, so it's going to be easier for us now to ask of them, urge of them to invest in health infrastructure instead of just thinking that they are going to be safe somewhere else in Europe. Of course, inequality needs to be addressed. And one of the things that we must be absolutely clear about is that there are people who benefit from inequality. Wherever there's disorder, somebody always rejoices. I mean, Namibia is one of the 3rd largest producer of uranium, but we have energy problem because our uranium is lighting Europe. Our diamonds are benefiting Europeans and the West. So we must not even be dilly-dally about this thing. Inequality is to the benefit of somebody. So we must ask ourselves a fundamental question. Those that are privileged, those that are benefiting from inequality, are they prepared for the purpose of humanity to be able to say, let's do something about that? And I think we have not been, particularly for those of us that are in the developing world, And I see Turkey as a country where we are in, has been formidable in terms of speaking that positionality. And I think we had weak leaders from the developing world who are unable to stand up. In platforms such as this, we start praising the West. We must look into their eyes and say that, things cannot continue the way they are. Certainly for us as a new generation of young leaders.
Okay. Well done, man. Now, let's talk about mental health.
Yeah.
This is a topic which is of paramount importance. Since the pandemic began, it has taken a huge toll on the mental health of people, especially youngsters. Kenidra, I know you are a mental health advocate. Number one, tell me what kind of mental health problems are on the rise, especially during this pandemic, and how to address them.
I would definitely say anxiety and depression is a huge thing. And speaking from experience, I feel like, when we were forced to social distance and everything, going back around people, it was like, I don't know, I guess I forgot how to interact for a minute, or, I'm still coming around, but I just got anxiety because you're just like, are they sick? They're coughing, it's just stuff like that where it's like you start looking at humans as opposition, as people who they can be potentially harmful to you. And I know it sucks to think that way, but and just going back into society, you feel like you just lost a sense of community, or you just feel like you don't you probably won't measure up. Oh, I was just by myself, I was alone, and you get so caught up in your own thoughts. And I would say another big thing for me was depression. I would just feel like I had no purpose, and especially not being around friends, or not doing the work that I do, not being able to reach communities. And I just grew, more and more depressed, and just kind of feeling what's the point of anything, But I would say a lot of my friends have gone through a lot of the same things, And like I said, anxiety and depression were two of the things that's more common right now, at least.
I want to focus on the role of media throughout this pandemic. Now, I remember once I had interviewed this mental health advocate back when the pandemic was in its early stages, and she told me that it's not a good idea for especially youngsters to spend too much time on television reading negative news about the pandemic. Do you think that has played a role in perhaps triggering depression and anxiety among the youth?
Yes, absolutely. And I remember getting so caught up. You see a lot of things about COVID-19 and vaccines, and it's people going back and forth. And I don't want to get too deep into that, but I remember just being so consumed in it, and just not really knowing what I stand for. And I feel like I was getting so caught up in social media, and it's what do I believe? I'm losing a sense of my own morals and my own beliefs. It's pretty sad to even think, but and just seeing people bickering and everything, it's kind of what has the world become? People are suffering, and people are just being super mean on the internet. And it's I'm trying to still have compassion for these people. Yeah, they're struggling just as I am. They come with a different approach. Not saying it's okay, but I was getting a lot of that, and then I don't know. I just feel just being so caught up in social media. But it was kind of hard not to be on social media. You lose.
Because you always felt this urge to see
you're
what's happening.
Where's my community? And you're trying to even if you have to find it virtually, so I feel maybe that was an upside of it too. But I know we're talking about the negative impacts, but yeah, I would just say that I was just getting so caught up in that, and I was losing reality. But it's what is reality right now for me? I don't even know what's up and what's down, I don't even know. I'm just here. I'm just trying to go with the flow of life right now. And if I have to kill time with social media, then so be it. And even know that it was impacting my mental health, I felt myself more it was just I feel I used to isolate as a choice until it wasn't a choice anymore. But I think that was the hardest part for me. But like I said, I've gained a lot of, I guess, meaningful connections. And I also think that's important to also acknowledge as well.
Okay, great point.
Yeah.
Now, Tanzila, of course, the issue of mental health, like I mentioned earlier, is of paramount importance. It is something which is taken seriously in the developed countries, but I know as someone who comes from a developing country, mental health is something which people don't care much about. How do we ensure that officials, authorities, governments of developing countries pay importance to this issue of mental health?
I think, unfortunately, even today, in the country that I live in, the part of the world that I come from, mental health is seen as a stigma, and the therapy of it, the treatment of it, is seen as a bigger stigma. So if you have someone with a mental issue in the family, that's fine, as long as no one finds out about it. So that is a pandemic in its own way, that we have so many people among us who are suffering from different levels of mental illnesses, and they do not have the access to get any sort of service or healthcare. And this applies to people with disabilities as well. And sometimes I think I've broadened my definition of disability. Like, a person could be completely fine on their feet, but they're bombarded with so many cultural and social norms that they're not allowed to leave the home. That could be a woman, for instance, in my world. Sometimes I look at women and say, you know what, I don't know which one's the disabled one sometimes. Because there's a cultural disability, then there are other barriers, there's a financial disability, etc., etc. And sometimes it all attacks on one person as well. And mental health is something that is now being slightly touched upon by a lot of different advocates and activists and media moguls and media in itself, but it's a very long way to go. And I think the conversation has not reached our dinner tables yet. I will believe that we're in the right direction with the right pace when it reaches our dinner table, when we're able to discuss as a family what everyone else is
Tell me
feeling.
why we are not able to discuss as a family the issue of mental health in developing countries. What is the issue?
I think it's a sense of denial. It's a sense of denial, and it's a sense of false perception of being perfect. And I'm sorry, but social media needs to be held accountable for this as well, because it's creating a very false narrative of how a community, a person, a family should look like, how a person should look like. And that's impossible. I cannot compete with a social media photoshopped model. That's impossible for me until unless I'm a bot or I'm in the metaverse. See what I mean?
We're going to discuss that in this forum.
So having said that, but there's a long way to go there. We need to fix the real world first. Having said that, I think we can fight this through conversation, to bring it up in our normal conversations, to speak up what we feel like, and make it a norm to ask people, how do you feel, instead of asking a vague question like, how are you? That will make a difference.
Okay. Joshua and Job, I will come to you, but I have to add one more question here. When we get injured, we break our elbow, we have a wound or something, we seek help, we go to a doctor. But most of the times when there is something wrong with our brain, we don't go to anyone, right? I mean, especially in the developing countries.
Yes.
How do we encourage, especially the youth, to take a stance when you feel there is something wrong with your brain and you need to seek help? How do you encourage them to take a stance? What kind of role do you think families have to play, parents have to play in encouraging the youth to take a stance if they feel there's something wrong with their mental health?
I think it's a tough situation over here, because sometimes here it's children versus the parents, and who wants to be in that situation? So sometimes as a child you're trying to convince your parents that you need help, and they're like, no, just study less, or don't be that ambitious, or stop eating junk food, stop spending too much time on your phone. They have a list of suggestions for us. And this one time someone told me that the parents said, oh, we're your therapists. We can just give you therapy.
Right.
Now, that's a great idea for a conversation, but we need to understand this is a medical thing. It's not a social thing.
Just like you go to a doctor, to a surgeon.
It has to be diagnosed. It has to be treated. There are
Correct.
certain levels of therapy. And it has social consequences. Of course, it affects people around you. But this is where we not understand that we can't just treat it through conversation. Conversation, good idea. 2 points for that. But the treatment is not that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah,
I want to pick up on the issue of social media that she mentioned, but I see you want to add something.
Yeah,
so
I was just
ahead.
going to say off the back of that, I mean, if that's all right to make it like conversational, I feel like what's really important with what you're saying is like, of course that makes sense in a family unit to be able to provide mental health care, but obviously through parents, sometimes that trauma often exists maybe because of your parents in some ways and the trauma that's passed down from you. So it has to be objective, you know, it has to be from someone who doesn't have that relationship with you, your close relationship with you, you know, I mean, it has to come from an external perspective, you know. I just wanted to add that because I think you see, you know, obviously traumatized people in all areas of society, but the objectivity with that is very important. Someone who hasn't got any preconceived idea of what your life is and who you are, you know.
It's a very good point, Joshua. And what kind of role do you think the social media? Now let's focus this discussion. We are in the dying minutes of this session, so let's try to talk about how we can build back together. And I feel social media has a pivotal role to play here. Joshua, what kind of changes do you think we need to make to social media in order to ensure a successful, effective, efficient recovery from this pandemic?
Well, yeah, I think, you know, the parent companies and the media companies have got a big role to play, you know, in this, in doing better. But honestly, while we're waiting for that to happen, we can advocate for that to happen. I think your personal choices are important too. What's amazing about this group of people, and why I'm so happy to meet the other people here on this panel, is you learn about one another. You see the spaces people are creating on social media to talk about what's happening where they are, or, you know, to be able to advocate for the issues they're advocating, to be able to create a space where, for me, look, social media is like, I don't know, maybe it's like a car or something. You can get drunk and joyride it and crash, or you can use it to take you from A to B. It's a destination for me. It's like a way of being able to go, okay, well, look, luckily I've developed a...
So you feel not many people are using this social media to go from destination A to destination B?
No, I feel like a lot of people are getting lost, and it's not their fault, because you are bombarded by these social norms and these kind of perceptions, especially from where I come at it from, as far as like beauty and what that looks like. For me, that's what really gets me on social media, is the idea of how you should look. I mean, and that as your leading reason to use this app, if it hasn't happened already, it's going to become very unhealthy for you. So for me, I look at it like I used to play music. Maybe it's like a better analogy is it's like my amplifier. You know what I mean? I can plug into this thing and turn it up a bit and be like, this is just a megaphone to maybe talk about something. But I've also found it an amazing tool to connect with people. People pick me up from airports in new countries. I've got to know people who've become friends, grassroots like movements around the world that I spend time with now and I talk and connect with. So I just say that, yes, we need the parent companies to do better with these things, but in the meantime, we all need to do better at trying to allow more space. And then just quickly, because I know we're in dying seconds here, I think something that you mentioned, Kenidra, is we forget sometimes that there's like a human being there behind the digital sphere, you know? It's so easy to sort of just get into this comment thread and you forget there's this person with like eyes and a face and who is expressive like you are, but on social media, it's very difficult to remember that sometimes when we're talking to one another. But in conversation, it's a different experience. So I just think more personal awareness is like a good step forward.
Indeed. Job. Certainly, social media has a very important role to play here. When we talk about social recovery, we have to talk about social media. But again, in the developing world, there are so many issues that are faced by the masses, but no one even knows that they are facing those issues. So how do we ensure that those issues, especially in the developing world, are highlighted on social media?
Yeah. Just before we come to shortly, I just wanted to pick up something, to give you an anecdote on mental health. We had a Minister of Health in Namibia, Bernard Haufiku. He's a medical doctor by profession, so usually in politics, we just get anybody. You can get an engineer as a Minister of Health. So at one point, we got it right by having this medical doctor as a Minister of Health. So one day he stood up in Parliament and he said, mental health is a serious issue. And he's saying, it might be possible that 50% of you here as members of Parliament are suffering from mental health. And people laugh about it. Yeah, but it made some of us actually realize that, I would think that mental health probably starts from 0 to 100. The mental health problems that we are aware of...
If I may interject, is that ignorance or lack of awareness?
I was exactly coming to that. So the mental health that society is aware of is probably the one that moved from 80% to 100. But we don't actually understand that before you got to the 80, there's something else that is there. So that is why we have to strike a balance. Mental health requires a lot of expert input, but we also need to have a conversation about it. That's why I agree with Tanzila to say that let's have this specific conversation. Now, with regard to social media, I take the same approach that that has been taken here, that we cannot take a universal approach to social media. Is bad or it's good. It can be both way. It can take you to a destination. You can, if you are drunk in it, you can crash. The example that he just gave. And I think we, as society, we must take responsibility and see and assess every aspect. How does that influence us? For example, in the developing world, our children have been brought up by these cartoons from the West. And your child that is 1 year or 2 years is watching this cartoon and they start behaving in a particular way. So what the West is actually doing through these cartoons, you are in their house, but the West are actually bringing up your children in terms of a mannerism. So we have to take responsibility and say, what is it that we have to do? For instance, there's a new character of Superman, and that new character of Superman that is coming is actually having, it's a character that embodies a lot of Western value. And this Superman character will be all over the world, including the developing world. Who do you blame? Do you blame the West? Somebody definitely must be responsible and be able to say, what is actually happening? You have parents, for instance, if my child is on Twitter, I should be on Twitter and also just check up and see what my child is doing on Twitter.
Right.
So if we don't take responsibility and we go and blame, how do you blame Twitter, for instance? How do you blame Facebook, for instance? No, it's Facebook and this is what is basically happening. You must be able to see what is happening with your family, with your social media can also be used. I mean, in the developing world, for instance, when many people go to the urban centers, they create WhatsApp groups.
Right.
And they are able to help each other. They are able to get news faster of people who are dead and things. One person goes to the village and there's no network. When they come back, they communicate on social media with everybody else. The news that was going to be very difficult to reach out to everybody. So we cannot take this universal. It's nice to speak about the better world, but there is also unity in diversity. Our standpoint and our approach towards unity must not be uncritical. We must understand our diversity and embrace our diversity so that we have a unity in diversity.
That's a very good point. I just had my director signal me that we are unfortunately out of time. It's such an important topic. Of course, we have to take actions on an individual level, but I think the idea is to build back together. Kenidra, Tanzila, Joshua, and Job, thank you very much. And thanks to the audience, as they say in Turkish. Çok teşekkürler. Now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Rumeysa Chodar.